Thank you, Gary. Good evening, everyone. This is the May 13th meeting for the Williamson County chapter of Native Plant Society of Texas. And we're going to talk briefly about business and then move on to our program. I thought tonight I would talk about cedar sage. This is a great plant to start from seed. So this has a winter rosette, which is very nice. Always nice to have something evergreen in your garden, and it does make a nice shade ground cover. You can see the leaves are a little bit larger on this plant, so it'll do quite a bit of shade. And this is just a few days ago. This is an early spring bloomer, blooms prolifically in the spring, and then it has seeds for most of the summer with a smattering of blooms. But the seeds are great for the birds, so always leave the seed heads on, even though a lot of people would cut them off, but you need to leave your seeds for the birds, everyone. Now, it's also gets its name cedar from being, grows underneath an ash juniper. And also very highly deer resistant. It is a sage, a salvia, so it's in the mint family. Chapter activities, not a whole lot going on still. Berry Springs Park continues with the invasives removal. Charles Newsom does that. And Berry Springs Park and Preserve, Nest, and Spirit Rains, we've got various projects there that we monitor to make sure they're successful and provide any maintenance needed. Georgetown Public Library, same thing. We've had Agnes Platino and Marilyn Purrs for many years, taking care of that and getting the help from the other chapter members when they needed it, but they did the bulk of the work. However, they have decided that it's time to turn it over to the chapter, and we're looking for somebody to lead that effort. You can get in touch with Beth Irwin, who runs our projects, and our plant sale, or myself, either one, if you have an interest. It's basically just keeping an eye on it and then letting us know when you need volunteers to come help with cleanup, or contacting the city if it needs any irrigation changes or mulch or any other, we do replantings there, etc. So that's a low maintenance, been there a while, so it's pretty well established, and it's just keeping it looking nice for the public to see and advertise native plants and advertise our chapter. NIPSOT, the state had a board meeting a couple of weeks ago. They updated our COVID-19 policy. This is statewide. So we are required to follow the current CDC guidelines. We can set stricter policies for meetings, demo garden, plant sales, field trips, any activity for our chapter. And really the reason we'd want to do that is if we were in a high infectious area, we would want to be stricter and maybe not do indoor meetings, etc. We're just starting. The library is going to allow rooms to be rented on June the 1st. So we don't know when we'll be able to get a room there, but we can also look around for other venues to hold meetings. However, our next couple of speakers are going to be Zoom still, because that's the way we set them up, thinking this might last a while longer. The Zoom's been great because we've been able to reach outside of the immediate area to get speakers. And we even have one speaker coming from Maryland. So that's really interesting to be able to reach different subject matters and have them come and talk to us. So other activities, the field trip committee is busy behind the scenes. They've been talking to the Travis Audubon Society, the Baker Sanctuary, and they have provided them with our interpretive plant signs, all the files, so that they can use them as a starting point for their signage for the Baker Sanctuary. One of the gentlemen contacted us. He had seen the plant signs at the Brushy Creek Trail and got very excited and wanted to be able to use them. So thanks to the field trip committee, we are sharing the original files so they can make their own signs from them. River Ranch Park, they're wrapping up a plant survey list there. River Ranch bought some additional acreage, so they're going to be looking at what plants are on that additional acreage. That is the field trip committee only. That park is still closed, but they'll be releasing the plant survey and planning a future walk at River Ranch. And let's see, there's a new preserve coming up in Williamson County, and the team is looking into a possible plant survey there. They're in talks with the people at that preserve now. And the I-35 rest stop pollinator gardens, those are the gardens along at the rest stops. And so we're looking at possibly doing a field trip up. There's one up near the Untitled Chapter, takes care of it. So it's up near Salado up there. And we may ask for volunteers to come up and do a field trip / maintenance. So, and they are working on other field trips, especially now that we have a little looser guidance from the state office. So we appreciate that. Membership recognition pins, we sent an email out to everyone asking you to vote for your favorite. Actually, asked you for suggestions first. We got suggestions in quite a few members. And then after that was all compiled by the state, they did this statewide. They had us vote for the top 5 flowers. And the lifetime membership pin is going to be the NIPSOT logo with the blue bonnet, of course. But the 5 flowers that won, here's our antelope horn, which we know and love, and wine cup, bluebells, gaillardia, and Turk's cap. All good choices, all very distinct flowers on those. So that will be a nice one. Nice to see those pins. They're out getting bids and working on that still. Nominations are open for our board. Our next term starts in September. I'm on my 2nd year, so I'll be finishing out and we'll be handing it over to someone else. I will become the past president. That's an automatic board position. And then we are accepting nominees for all the other positions. We have some people in mind. We have a committee put together to call some of the members and ask them if they would like to serve, but we need your help in getting good candidates. And we very much prefer if you talk to that person and said, is it okay if I nominate you for, say, director or president or whatever? Because there's a lot of people that would not be happy to be called if be nominated without their permission. So anyway, we look forward to filling that board position, and we'll be voting in July. Nope, we'll be announcing in July. We'll be voting in June, and after the nominations close, we'll send out an email, and then in July we will announce the winners. There's a small chance we'll be back in a room, so we're not ruling that out yet. We'll have to see how things go. Upcoming programs, we have landscaping with native plants up next month, 10 design principles for home gardeners, which of course is true for any type of landscaping with plants, but she's going to put a nice native spin on it for us. And then in the July 8th meeting, when we announce the election results, the field trip committee is putting something together on trail signs and field trips. And who knows what we'll come up with. It's still in the works. I haven't seen an outline yet, so I'll be bugging them about that. In August, foraging for edible plants. That's always interesting. And then in October, like I said, we've got the Humane Gardener who will be coming from Maryland over Zoom. And then November 11, we have bee communities and restored prairies. And we're very much hoping to be in a meeting room for that. And we're also hoping to have our holiday party in December. And we'll have to see what that's going to look like. The board will get together and decide what's reasonable to do at that time. We're also hoping to continue with Zoom if we are meeting in a room, and do a live meeting in the room, but also broadcast over Zoom and continue to post our meetings on YouTube. So that would allow us to reach more people. We understand that a lot of people can't make a certain day and certain night and certain time. That's gets harder and harder these days, doesn't it? So if you have any program speaker ideas, once this year is full, we'll work on next year and contact Susie Hickman or send an email through our blog. We're the Williamson County chapter. Our blog is our chapter newsletter. So any news, any information, any special articles, items of interest come out through our blog, and you have to sign up. Even if you're a member, if you sign up to be a member, you have to sign up for the blog separately. And we don't, you have to opt in. We don't automatically sign you up. Not everyone wants to get an email. Non-members, you're welcome to sign up as well. And we don't bug you or share our list with anyone. It's simply to get our blog information. You can find us on YouTube and past talks on YouTube, Facebook we post, and Instagram. We also post our various topics and speakers and such coming up. Tonight, we're going to give away Texas native plants, landscaping region by region, to one lucky winner. There is, April's winner was Michelle of Georgetown. She won Gardener's Latin from our last talker. And there are 35 chapters in Texas. So even if you don't join the Williamson County chapter, there may be a chapter closer to you that allows you where they would have plants more appropriate for your area. But you can always be on our blog or be a member of more than one chapter. So I say that because we had someone from Houston sign up and for the Williamson County chapter, and that's fine. But they also have a local chapter in Houston. So check the map on the state website, nipsot.org. Planting natives from seed, I'm happy to introduce Anthony Falk, Dr. Tony here. He's with the Caesar Clayburgh Wildlife Research Institute. He's with Texas A&M University. He's worked with the South Texas Natives Program for 11 years. He did collections and evaluations. He coordinated that. And he's the current assistant director of South Texas Natives. He's a research scientist in habitat restoration and oversees several projects across the state. We're very lucky to have him here tonight, and we look forward to what he has to say. So I am going to unshare my screen, and we are good.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the chance to speak with everybody tonight. Hopefully I can give you a little bit of information and we can get out and put some more native seed on the ground. So my talk tonight is going to focus on species and seed selection. Let's see here if I can advance the screen. There we go. So how to decide what to plant. As I'm sure all of you know, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of native species to each and every location. So how to decide what specific plants are best adapted to your sites. One of the easiest ways to do that you can do from your living room is to use Web Soil Survey. I'll go through a little bit of how to do that real fast. Another really fun way to figure out what to plant is to go through and look for undisturbed areas near your planting site. These are areas that have either never been disturbed or are areas that maybe have not been disturbed for a long period of time. Some good ways to find these places is railroad right-of-ways. You know, a lot of times you'll have the railroad and then a little bit of space between the property boundary. Those are excellent places to find some relic sites that haven't been disturbed for very long periods of time. One that a lot of people forget about is some of the older cemeteries. Along the periphery of those, there's a lot of times a lot of different native plant communities in those areas that don't necessarily get mowed regularly. A lot of those cemeteries have been in, either family holdings or county holdings for long periods of time. And they often offer little bits of sanctuary along the edges of places that hadn't been disturbed for a long time. Field edges is another good place to get out and look for areas. There was one really neat one that I found down in the Rio Grande Valley as I was working on my master's project that was about a 2-acre triangle piece that, for whatever reason, when they were laying out field locations and original plots, there was this little triangle that just didn't end up in anything. Had some of the most unique and diverse brush that I've yet to see anywhere across the state. So finding small areas like that, maybe got left out of a little plot or, didn't quite fit into the squares when they were originally laying things out, is another good place to be able to look and find what native plants could have been in your region or at your location prior to any disturbance. Excuse me. Finally, the ditches and the county roads. I know a lot of people in the past have given, highway workers and road workers and TxDOT a bad reputation for some of the stuff that, has appeared to be on the highways or people have thought that they've planted in the past. But realistically, these roadside edges and these county roads in particular, you get off the main highways, are excellent places to see what could be at your planting site. They offer a lot of places that, maybe get mowed only twice a year, or if it's a small enough road, maybe don't get mowed at all. So those are excellent places that you can get out and try and get around different places and see what might be growing in an area that you're looking at doing some different kinds of seedings. And those can help dictate what species to pick from. Another excellent source is there are tons of people out there that you can ask for advice from. There's the Texas Native Seed Staff. There are 6 of us spread throughout the state. We each have regional directors. I'm the South Texas Assistant Director. There's a Coastal Prairies Assistant Director. He's based out of Victoria. East Texas natives, a Central Texas natives, a West Texas natives, and then a Permian Basin and Panhandle. So each of those assistant directors are excellent sources of information. All of their contact information can be found on our website. And then we also have, through Texas Native Seeds, a seed selection tool that I will also be walking you through. Texas Parks and Wildlife staff is another excellent source of free information. A lot of those folks get out on a lot of different places and can see a lot of different private lands and know a lot of their plants, because without the habitat and without the plants, they don't have the wildlife. So a lot of those guys have had to learn their plants so they can better help the wildlife. And then finally, your NRCF staff. One thing I will definitely say is please ask as many questions as possible whenever you're doing any native seeding. There's lots and lots of information out there. And maybe if you're having issues with something or have tried something and it hasn't worked, somebody else has tried it in the past and can maybe give you a little bit of advice. So one of the other things that I really like to focus on is, once we kind of have an idea of what native plants are available out there, we need to kind of shrink that list down a little bit based on what the goals of our actual seeding project are. Some really common goals that we see and that we work with is, one of the big ones is restoration or conversion. Another one that's been growing lately is creating pollinator habitat. One that we don't hear of as much, but is still definitely very applicable, especially across the lots of South Texas, is to increasing our grazing ability. Some places that have been really heavily overgrazed in the past, coming in and reseeding in those areas to be able to increase the amount of grass and increase the amount of available forage. Landscaping, using native plants for landscaping. As we all know, with more and more water restrictions, finding native plants that may be more water wise and using those in our landscaping is definitely well worth the effort. And then the last one that seems to be a bit more trickier, at least on our end, is the native yards. So Web Soil Survey, for those of you who have never used it, you can just search the internet for Web Soil Survey, and it is a program of the USDA NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service. When you search that, the screen on your top left, there is the first screen that you'll come to. You just click the box or click the green button that says Start WSS, which is Start Web Soil Survey. Within that, you'll get a map of the entire United States. You'll have to zoom in and select your area of interest. On their website, it's called AOI. Once you've selected that area interest, and that can be your property, maybe your property and a couple around it, you'll get a map similar to that seen in that middle window. And to get the information that you need to click on the Soils Data Explorer on the top. And then there's a second tab there that says Ecological Sites. That will pull up this colored map. You'll click over here to this View All Ecological Sites, and that will then pull up this window that you see in the bottom right-hand corner, especially under the Ecological Dynamics tab there. That brings this somewhat lengthy narrative that gives lists of what plants would have historically grown on that site. That information's been compiled by a number of folks who are considered experts in the field, and it's based on climate information, soils, past land uses, things like that, and is the best information that we have of what we think would have historically grown there. The other tool that I mentioned is the Texas Native Seeds Seed Mix Map. There's a link there to the website that takes you to that map. When you first go to the website, you get this picture that's the state of Texas with our different project regions. You click within a project region and it zooms you in. So for this demonstration, I zoomed in on South Texas. You then click on your county and the smaller box pulls up that I zoomed in on there. And within that box, you get the different ecoregions within that and 2 soil choices within that ecoregion. Some areas don't necessarily have multiple soil types. So you can see coastal sand plains only has sandy soils. But then once you click on the soil type within that ecoregion, it provides you a PDF that gives you seed mix recommendations and possible seed dealers that you could purchase that seed from. Also on there is the contact information for the local or the regional assistant director if you have any more questions. So those are all different locations that you can go to kind of help guide you. But what are some different considerations to take into account for each of your different goals? And then I'll also discuss a couple of species that you could be using depending on that goal. So the first one I want to talk about is doing restoration or conversion, excuse me. And what are some considerations to think about when you're doing those? One important thing that is often missed is what are you doing restoration of and to what point? And then does that restoration fit for what should be at that soil type or for that region? For example, what I'm talking about is tall grass prairie restoration does not necessarily fit for every place across the state. Maybe if you're on a shallow soil type, you should be looking at doing more of a short to mid-grass prairie restoration. Or if you're in, say, a wetland area, maybe we shouldn't be looking at using upland species. We need to be using more wetland species. So we always need to have that, what are we restoring and what should we be restoring to in the back of our minds when we're doing restoration. The same thing when we're doing conversion. What are we going from to what? Are we looking at doing a conversion from, say, brush habitat or mesquite areas to grasslands? Or are we looking at doing a conversion from non-native species to native grasslands? All of those different things are going to somewhat dictate what different species that we use and the different combinations of species that would probably work the best in those situations. Another thing when it comes to doing restoration or conversion is we need to remember that diversity is key, with the caveat that we don't want to add so much diversity that we want to take away from what works. As we said, there's many different options out there when it comes to choosing different native plant species and varieties. So while including as much diversity as we can is nice, we don't want to be including things that may not be as adapted, or varieties that may not be as adapted, to take away from those core species that should make up the dominance of that area. You know, an example would be for a tall grass prairie through central Texas. We don't necessarily want to add 40 different forb species and take away to the point that we only have maybe 5% little bluestem. As I'm sure most of you have noticed as you drive around a lot of central Texas, little bluestem is the dominant species for that area. So we want to make sure that when we're reseeding or we're doing restoration of that little bluestem still makes up a large portion of that seed mix, so it maintains the dominance in the way that community works. The last thing I want to mention about considerations for doing restoration conversion is to remember to include multiple different ecological stages or successional stages when we're doing our seed mixes. One of the things we've learned from doing restoration, particularly in South Texas, is that unlike some of the true prairie regions of the Midwest, we need to include those early successional species. We can't just jump to the big blue stems, the yellow Indian grasses, the switch grasses. Those species do not seem to establish and grow as quickly down here as they do in some other regions of the country. So we need those early successional, some of those weedy type species, to be able to help fill in the gaps until those later successional things come along. I had mentioned really focusing on some of the early successional species. Some of those across the state include the hooded windmill grass, which is pictured there in the middle, hairy grama, which is kind of peeking in there on the left, and then the one that decided to photobomb me here and I wasn't paying attention, the blurry one in the front is sand dropseed. All three of those species are relatively short growing, relatively short duration species, but all germinate very quickly and very readily. So they kind of hold the world together until some of the later successional stuff can get established. One of your mid-successional species that's very dominant across a lot of central Texas is side oats grama, also our state grass. This is another one that is a good bunch grass. There's several different varieties of side oats grama on the market currently, and is a good one to kind of fill the gap between those really early successionals and those really large late successionals. Finally, everybody knows little bluestem. This is an excellent species for restoration and many other uses, really throughout the state. Again, there are lots of different varieties of little bluestem, and I'll get into those later on in the presentation. One of our other goals, pollinator habitat. So when we're doing pollinator habitat, there's a few things to consider in this as well. One is what is the pollinator species of interest that we're really looking at focusing on? Is it bees? Is it butterflies? Is it hummingbirds? Because each of those feeds and visits flowers in a different way, and we may need to cater our species that we're using to those species that are visiting those a little bit. Second is timing of flowering. You know, as was mentioned earlier, the cedar sage is a spring flowering. A lot of our native annuals are spring flowering, but there's also a lot of perennials and even some annuals that are summer or fall flowering. And a lot of times, in my experience, that fall flowering date is one that a lot of people seem to forget, but is probably just as important as the spring flowering period is. We want to consider whether we're using perennials or annuals, and then the maintenance that's required in these. That's another thing that a lot of people forget, or questions that I get, complaints almost, I would say, whether it be in the landscaping side of this or the pollinator side of it, is, well, I threw it out there and it's native, and why doesn't it look good all the time? As I'm sure you all know, that these things still require management and maintenance. The other thing when it comes to pollinators is that most of the larger commercial seed dealers throughout the state all have their own, their own pollinator blends. Some examples of those: Feed the Bees pollinator mix, Texas wildflower blend, Texas native wildflower mix. All three of those often have many of the same species in them and a lot of the same varieties. They're just tweaked a little bit depending on availability. As we're talking about pollinator plantings, we cannot forget about our milkweeds. Have to talk about those. There on the left is the Zozoides milkweed. A lot of research has shown that that's the preferred host of monarch larvae across Texas. We're currently working at releasing as the Zozoides release that would be adapted to South Texas. And we'll probably still work throughout a lot of Texas, but the original collections for that are originating in South Texas. There's limited supplies of that available right now. One that you see marketed pretty much across the state. There in the center is the tropical milkweed. Personally, I've never really seen tropical milkweed much further west than, say, I-35. It's really been restricted to the eastern part of the state. And then if anybody's kind of headed west and north, I'm sure you've noticed the broadleaf milkweed is, that one seems to stand out pretty distinctly as we get into this midsummer. One of the perennials that actually has several different varieties on the market is awnless bush sunflower. This is a subshrub species that, when maintained, will make a bush, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet. Pretty yellow flowers, will bloom all year, well, spring, summer, and fall. The one downside with awnless bush sunflower is it is highly palatable to deer. And so if you're doing any seeding in locations that deer can access it, we often have hard times finding or it is heavily utilized by the deer. Another one that's in the pipeline for release in South Texas is tropical sage, cousin to the cedar sage. Excellent hummingbird plant. I have it here in my landscaping here around the house. We've actually included it in a lot of restoration seedings that we've been doing as experiments, and it's done really well in those plantings as well. Mealy blue sage is one that is usually readily available, does well throughout central Texas. You can see the picture of the monarch using that mealy blue sage. That picture was taken on a southern Blackland Prairie site just outside of San Antonio earlier this spring. This again was established by seed in one of our restoration plantings, and is one that's performed really well for us using a commercial variety that's readily available. One of our other goals, again, this one's probably not as much utilized anymore, but still readily a consideration, is grazing. When it comes to doing the grazing, one thing we want to remember, that in the similar fashion to when it comes to restoration, diversity is key here. One of the things that reseeding with natives and grazing natives that they give us that many of the non-natives don't, is that high diversity native seedings create year-round production, as well as year-round nutrient availability, where a lot of our non-natives that have traditionally been kind of our workhorses in grazing have these real high peaks and real low valleys when it comes to forage availability and nutrient availability. By having the diversity of a diverse native seed mix, we can stretch that nutrient availability across much longer periods. Another consideration is what species of grazers. If we're looking at cattle versus goats versus sheep, each of those eats differently and have different nutrient requirements. And so we're going to need to focus our seed mix based on that. Finally, Grazing natives is very different than grazing non-natives and requires a significant amount of diligence. We can't just dump animals out there and turn around and walk away. We've really got to pay attention to what they're doing and keep some key measurements so we know when we need to move things or pull things out. This is where we really get into these big grasses, the things we've heard about throughout the true prairie regions, the cattle grazer stuff, the yellow Indian grass, big blue stem. One that a lot of people don't think about, grows across South Texas and into West Texas and part of the hill country, is a grass called pink pappas grass. Does not get as tall as those true big grasses like the big blue stem and yellow Indian grass, but forage production wise is probably in the same ballpark, as it produces a very dense a clump that is excellent palatability in the forage. One of our other goals is in the yard. This is one that has always, this is one that's always seemed to have been a problem. And some considerations when it comes to that is that the watering of a native yard is going to be very different than the watering of some of the more typical yard species, species used for sod. They're not very shade tolerant, and they're much harder to keep clean. You know, there are several varieties of buffalo grass, and I can get into some of those here in a minute. But just in general, our native species are meant to be diverse and not to be single species type plantings. The best uses of native species in a yard type setting is kind of on the periphery of your actual yard. Maybe we can create a 10 or a 15-foot buffer along the outside edge that's a short to mid-height yard edge. Something that is an all grass mix that maybe stays in that, you know, maybe 10 to 16 inch height range, that works as a buffer there along the edge. Some of the species that are definitely options. One is buffalo grass, which is pictured here. You can see this is a buffalo grass patch in my yard, and there's definitely a good number of weeds in it. There are very specific varieties for sod of buffalo grass. Another one is curly mesquite. One that I've seen several people use in South Texas is slender grama. Hairy grama and blue grama are also used. Blue grama really starts to die out as you get much further past, you know, North Texas. It definitely grows up into the panhandle, but does not seem to do as well in some of the southern regions. There is a product out there called Habiturf that is a blend of buffalo grass, curly mesquite, blue grama, and I believe hairy grama. But again, as we get much further south, the blue grama and that really doesn't play as much of a role. Some of the seed dealers will be able to create you kind of custom yard blends. One that I would imagine would work fairly well throughout Central Texas and our full sun areas would be a mix of buffalo grass, hairy grama, and slender grama. One of our last goals here is landscaping. Some things to consider when it comes to landscaping. Again, they're still plants. They need water. They need maintenance. The somewhat ill thought of it's native, so I can just plant it and walk away does not fit. It's not going to look pretty. Some other things that we need to make sure and consider is the size that these things are going to get to, whether they're shade tolerant, how long these plants will live. You know, the picture up there on the top, some squares we did for a landscaping in the Midland area. Those are irrigated kind of demonstration type, but some of those are made up of shorter duration species. And so the reality is they're going to die out in 2 to 3 years. So if you're looking at something long-term, that may not be the best option for you. And then finally is location. This is one, there's a lot of natives that are really pretty. You know, Ratama being one of them. If you're going to use a native Ratama that's got the thorns, we maybe not want to put that right on the bike path, you know, or right by our driveway, excuse me, where it could hook our clothes and things like that. Um, one that a lot of people like to use in their landscaping and do by seed is bluebonnets. There's a lot of different varieties of bluebonnets out there. You know, a lot of different colors now, which has always been surprising to me. You would think bluebonnets are blue, but we've now got the maroon hearts and the all maroons. The one important thing to remember about bluebonnets is that some of the most optimal time to be seeding your bluebonnets is in the late summer, early fall, as we're getting those fall rains. So we want to be planting those bluebonnets in the end of September to October, so they have enough time to form good, healthy rosettes, and it'll provide much better blooms for you in the spring. One that's not as readily available is Indian paintbrush. While you can get it occasionally, for the most part, it's going to be pretty hard to find on a commercial scale. When you can, you definitely are going to have to pay for it because it's difficult to produce. This, again, with Indian paintbrushes is like the bluebonnets. We want to be seeding that stuff in the fall so it can have time to overwinter and produce that rosette through the winter and then bloom for you in the spring. One of our native grasses that works really well in a landscaping setting is Hall's panicum. This is a short duration grass, typically is only living about 2 years for us, but forms a really pretty pink seed head when it's flowering, nice bright green, smooth leaves. Is an excellent species and a good substitute for some of the non-native grasses that are sold at your Lowe's and Home Depots and things like that. One of the other ones that I always like to substitute the large pampas grass with is a species called Big Saccaton. This is one that establishes readily from seed. It's going to be a similar structure to the pampas grasses, but it doesn't have that big white kind of fluffy seed head. You can see there on the left what those seed heads look like. But as far as a plant structure, a large, you know, maybe a visual barrier or something like that, a living fence, things like that, these work excellent in that kind of situation. So now that we've kind of talked about what we're going to select for the species, we need to talk about varieties. As you all can imagine, I'm sure there's very difference in the little blue stem that grows in the coastal sand plains that you can see in the top left, the coastal prairies that's in the top right, the cross timbers in the bottom right, and the trans pecos on the left. So several years ago, I contacted all of the commercial seed dealers that have seed marketed for sale across the state of Texas. They sent me what they had available at the time, and there was 87 different named varieties of native plants for sale marketed for Texas. And then there was another 267 native varieties that did not have specific names that were marketed for the state. So we've got a huge number of these different things to pick from. And you can see here in this list that there's multiples of certain species. You know, I just pulled out little blue stem here for an example. There are 6 different varieties of little blue stem marketed for the state of Texas. But if you really look at that list, there's only one that originated actually from within the state. These are all often sold and used throughout the state, but some of them can come as far away as Manhattan, Kansas, Oklahoma, and even into New Mexico. So how do we pick, if we've got 6 different varieties of, say, little blue stem to pick from, how do we pick the one that would best work in our region? Well, we want to be looking at where that seed originated from. And for those folks that like numbers and like this distinct boundaries, the numbers that have typically been used is 100 miles, seed that originated from either 100 miles east to west and within 200 miles north to south. Where those numbers come from is if you get beyond that 100 miles east to west, we start moving in rainfall bands. So you go from an average of in the 20s to an average of in the 30s and vice versa as you head west. And as you get out of that 200 miles north and south, we get some pretty distinct changes in daylight period which will change our flowering dates and things like that. More specifically, if we can find things that originated within the same ecoregion of our planting, and ideally if they had an origin that had the same soil type and even ecological site as to what we're doing. One of the very important things to remember on all of this is that seed origin has nothing to do with where the seed company is located or where that seed was produced. We're looking for for where that original parent material came from. Here's an example of two of the Untitled Chapter varieties that are adapted to Texas and sold in Texas. Haskell Untitled is kind of our tried and true variety. Was released in I believe the late 70s, came from Haskell, Texas. You can see my circle there is the 100 by 100 and 200 by 200. So where you're at there in Williamson County, unfortunately, Haskell Untitled would not fit within that. We have a South Texas germplasm release, which is made up of 6 different original collections. Our 200 or 100 by 100 by 200 circle there still unfortunately does not catch you there in Williamson County, but catches a whole different set of counties that is adapted to. The good news is we're currently working on a Central Texas release of Untitled Chapter. That's probably a little bit down the line, but once we get that on the market, you will have a Untitled Chapter variety that will fit within that circle for your region. So I've used the term, germplasm. You've heard me use VNS, and as you're looking to buy seed, you'll hear more terms: cultivars, wild harvest. So what does all of that mean? So a cultivar is a method of release that is done by the Natural Resource Conservation Service. To qualify for a cultivar, you have to do between 7 and 10 years worth of research on that plant material. A lot of times that cultivar is derived from a single plant, and they're often done and released for very specific uses. For example, the Haskell Untitled Chapter release was released for use by the highway department on the roadside and then as erosion control plant. So it was selected because out of all of the Untitleds they looked at, it had the highest basal coverage and number of tillers from that one plant. So that came from an individual plant within a whole bunch of different original collections. By doing that, it also limits the area of adaptation because you're only using a single plant out of a single population. But if you happen to be within the sweet spot of where that originated from, it's an excellent option for you. The second way of doing releases is a germplasm. These take a little bit less research. They're typically 3 to 5 years. Still have research, still have scientific backing, just not quite as long. And germplasms are typically derived from either single or multiple populations and are selected at the population level. So this is what we do in our Texas Native Seeds program. We're selecting populations, not individual plants. What that does for us is it helps us maintain a large genetic diversity and not so much focused. A lot of times we'll also release, as in our Untitled Chapter release, multiple populations. So then we're spreading those origins across multiple counties, multiple soil types, and blending it all together to give everybody the best possible option to have something that meets their planting site. The last version is a wild harvest or native. There's no research performed on these. They're often harvested from single populations, and a lot of times are actually harvested from the native stand. For a lot of things, this is going to be the only type of seed available, just because of the amount of effort that it takes in going forth to do germplasm and cultivar releases. So when we're talking about seed availability and looking at commercial versus wild harvest versus variety not stated or VNS. So all of our named varieties are going to be commercially produced. What does that give us? One, you have documentation into why and where those selections were made. So you can go back and look on, Texas Native Seeds website, any of the plant material centers who have made releases in the past, and look at their releases and look at their data on why they selected that and where it came from. What having the commercially produced seed gives you is, one, you'll have much cleaner seed product because those folks are keeping the weed seeds out of they're keeping the weeds out of their field. They're watering those fields, so you're getting improved seed quality. They're controlling pests in there. All of that is providing larger quantities of seed at lower prices because they're able to increase the efficiency of their production. Now, the caveat to that is not all species are going to be commercially produced. For things to be commercially produced, there has to be a large enough market to have somebody put in the investment into producing large production fields. We're talking production fields in the ballpark of 20 to 40 acres. So they have to be able to sell all of the seed produced off of that field over a large enough area. So that's where some of the variety not stated or VNS stuff comes in that they're going to have smaller markets or maybe only be used in smaller numbers of seed mixes. And that's where a lot of that stuff will come in. They're not necessarily bad things. They are just less researched, and you need to ask more questions when you're buying any of those products. Another thing to remember when it comes to seed availability is a lot of our wildflowers are difficult to produce. As I'm sure a lot of you know, their flowering dates are indeterminate. They tend to shatter. There's a whole suite of problems when it comes to doing commercial production on wildflower species. As a consequence, many of those are only going to be available as wild harvest or VNS varieties. Their availability is going to vary greatly from year to year. Bluebonnets is a prime example of that. This past year, the price of the bluebonnets that you could find was very expensive and the quantities were very limited. That's because the spring preceding that was very dry. When the rains did come, they came late. And so what crops were there, they weren't able to get in and harvest. So annuals like that, where there's few producers and they have to catch things just right with those wildflowers, their availability and their price can vary pretty greatly. Additionally, because of the difficulty and because of the way the seed market is set up, a lot of our wildflowers are really only produced by a handful of commercial growers. And then all of the other growers kind of buy and trade from those handful of growers. When we're buying seed, we want to make sure we're looking at seed tags. There's an example of a seed tag here. The main things that we're wanting to pick out on the seed tag is origin. So just because you're buying, say, a little blue stem from a seed salesman in Texas does not mean that that seed even was grown in Texas, originated in Texas, any of that. So you need to be looking at that place of origin. The second thing to look at is pure live seed, or PLS. Pure live seed is a percent purity times the viability, which is total germination and dormancy. We also need to look at the weed seeds that are in that seed lot, as well as other crops, and the date of that test. You typically want to have seed that's been tested within the last year. So I wanted to go through a little demonstration to describe pure live seed, because for a lot of people, that's kind of a funny subject or a difficult one to understand, because we think, well, a plant's making seed that has to be good seed. Well, in reality, a lot of our native, especially our native grasses, make a lot of structures that look like seeds, but they're not filled or they're not pollinated. There's a lot of different things that can go on. So if we take my screen here as a lot of seed, and we'll say that that's all little blue stem seed. But our purity is only 50% because a lot of it's unfilled. There's some other weed seeds in there. There's a lot of other things that can take up that 50%. So now that we're down to just, if we started with a pound of seed, we now only have a half of that is pure seed. And then another 10% of that is not good for whatever reason. So although it's an actual seed and it has a live part, or not, excuse me, not alive, but it has a caryopsis in it, for whatever reason, that caryopsis is already dead and it will not germinate even under the best of conditions. So if we were to buy a pound of seed on the bulk basis and it had a 50% purity with a 10% dormancy and germination rate, you would really only be getting 0.4 pounds of what you paid for. So that's where paying for things and buying things on the pure live seed basis can have a huge difference on what you're getting as a product. And this is hugely important in native seeds. A lot of our native seed products can vary greatly in PLS or pure live seeds. A lot of the big grasses, the little blue stems, the big blue stems, a lot of times will be in that 20 or even into the teens when it comes to percentages pure live seeds, while other things could be up as high as 80 or 90%. So you really need to be looking at those seed tags. All of the seed growers that are selling commercial seed get seed tests on the product they're selling. So you need to be asking for that information if they don't readily give it to you. And you can ask for more information if, say, they give you just the pure live seed or percentage of weed seeds, things like that. And some things to look for. As you can see there within this seed lot, there was barnyard grass and crabgrass in this sample of seed. In the last seed tag I had showed you, I forgot to point it out, but there was Bermuda grass in that seed. So if we're trying to do a native restoration and we're trying to keep as much native as we can without any non-natives, we'd be going backwards by using that seed lot because we'd be seeding Bermuda grass and what we're trying to seed. Paying attention to the other crops in Texas is hugely important because a lot of our non-native species are considered other crops because they've historically been used for cattle grazing or erosion control. Some examples of this include our Old World blue stems, Clayburgh, King Ranch, Angleton, a lot of the African love grasses, Wilmans, Lamans, and then, you know, one of the South Texas ones is buffalo grass. All of those are still commercially sold on the market today and therefore are listed as other crops. So we need to be looking at what other crops are falling in the seed that we're buying. One of the last couple of things I wanted to talk about is this: if you're looking at buying kind of pre-done mixes, a lot of the different seed companies have these available. This is an example of one that I was sent by a landowner. He had asked for just a native seed mix to be used in Southwest Texas and asked what my thought on this was. And this seed dealer, to increase I'm assuming to increase their percentage of being successful, had slipped Wilman's lovegrass in there as part of their seed mix. So this is one of those things that we need to be paying attention to the mixes that we're buying if we're doing pre-done mixes. You know, Wilman's lovegrass, Layman's lovegrasses. There's a number of these things, even buffalo grass. There's a lot of these things that for a lot of years were thought to be excellent species for erosion control. They produce seeds that were eaten by birds, a number of things, and are still included in a lot of seed mixes under the quote unquote native because they're mostly native. As I said before, and again to reiterate, when it comes to buying seed or doing any kind of reseeding, ask questions. There are lots of different locations out there to get information from. One I added on this slide that I didn't have on the other one was Texas A&M AgriLife. Those folks all have excellent backgrounds and can definitely help you out on that. I work with commercial seed dealers on a daily basis. But please always remember to keep in the back of your mind that those guys are salesmen. That's not to say that they're trying to cheat you out, but definitely be aware and be an informed buyer. You know, I'd ask a lot of questions. I'd probably get on those guys' nerves when I'm buying seed for research projects, because I'm asking, where did you get this from? Where does it originate from? What kind of weed seeds are in it? And they're always very willing to answer those questions. So using natives in whatever the case is they're, you know, especially in our landscaping, they're excellent alternatives to a lot of the stuff, the non-native stuff that you can buy. There's no harm in those escaping. And if you pick the right ones, there's a lot of times you'll probably be cussing yourself for using that native, because it will do so well and it will reseed itself. And you'll probably be pulling more of the ones that you didn't want to than leaving the ones you did. In general, most of our native species are much better for wildlife than the non-natives, and definitely can be more water smart than some of the other landscaping options out there. The downside to a lot of our natives is that they are significantly less developed. And what that means is if you're planting natives in say a landscaping setting or your yard, or even on the restoration side of things, the germination of them are much less reliable. It's not like planting a garden where, you know, if you're planting a corn or, you know, zucchini, whatever it happens to be, and you put 3 seeds in the ground, the chances of you getting at least 2, if not all 3 of those to germinate in your garden, that's not going to be the case when it comes to natives. There just isn't the amount of research into those to be able to provide that amount of reliability. Secondly, when it comes to kind of our long-term care of these things, there's not as much information and published information out there. You know, whether that's on a restoration or a grazing setting, to how many animals we can graze, how long can we graze things, you know, should we be mowing, can we spray, things like that. On the landscaping side of that, when should we prune, how much should we prune? There's just not as much information out there, because for the longest time, it was easier to use a lot of the non-native stuff than our natives. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, when you get it right, they can be aggressive. I planted a pink pappus grass here in the landscaping at my house. I am still pulling pink pappus grass seedlings out in a huge circle around where that plant is, and have been for the last 5 or 6 years. So if you get it right and you get that plant in a place that it's happy, it can definitely become somewhat aggressive. And with that, I've seen a handful of questions there in the Q&A. I will definitely try and answer any of those that are still lingering out there.
Hey, Tony, I can summarize those questions for you. We have a question from Barbara Call asking, why not plant bluebonnets when they go to seed naturally like now? Why do you wait until the fall?
So it suggests that people wait for the fall because as the commercial growers are harvesting that seed right now as it's naturally shattering on its own, and they will clean that seed and have it available for sale come like late summer, early fall. So you're getting the freshest clean seed of last year's harvest in the fall. What I see a lot of people do, and the reason I really emphasize seeding in the fall, is more because you hear a lot of people, or you see a lot of people want to do things as they see the flowers. And you'll notice the big box stores, quote unquote, will have bluebonnets for sale right now, as people are seeing that on the road, where a lot of people don't think about the fact that you need to be planting that stuff early if you're going to be doing it by seed.
Okay, thank you. And a question from Marianne Cox: Are the big Sacaton grass long-lived? And
yes, those are.
Tell me if I mispronounced that.
Nope, that's just right. The big Sacaton, no, they are very long-lived. There's some set of plants. The Plant Material Center here in Kingsville uses those as a wind block. Those plants, from my understanding, have been there over 20 years.
Oh, wow. And from Terry Glaser, he is doing a study on some native milkweeds and would like to talk to you about your references. Is it possible to get some contact information for you if folks have some follow-up questions?
Definitely they can. I will get a way to get that posted and get that out to you, either
Okay.
through a blog or email, or we'll definitely figure out how to get that information out. If not, you can definitely go to our website, either South Texas Natives or Texas Native Seeds, and get my contact information through that.
Okay, thank you, Tony. That's all the questions I noted. Did any of the other panelists see any?
I didn't notice any other than that, no.
Okay.
I saw a
Wait,
hand go up from Dick
on
Davison.
chat.
Asked him to provide that here in the chat if he had a question. I just saw his hand go up. And then it looks like Barbara has a follow-up question about bluebonnets, about them being so long-lived in the seed bank. Would it be bad to plant? Maybe that's now.
Yeah, you can definitely plant them now, and a lot of our a lot of our bluebonnet seeds, excuse me, a lot of our wildflower seeds are very hard seeded. And so a lot of times if, I'm speaking with the landowner about doing a more of a restoration type planting, we'll focus much more specifically on the grass restoration and much less on the forbs, because there's so many of those flowering species that'll persist in that seed bank for a long period of time.
Okay, thank you. Looks like I've got Kathy Galloway's hand up. Kathy, I'm going to allow you to talk. Oh, she went away. So maybe it was a false alarm. Same for Angela. I can allow you to talk.
About buying milkweed seeds. Douglas King Seed Company in San Antonio does have the Zozoites milkweed. There's several companies out there have antelope horns. And all the research that we've done, the Zozoites seems to germinate much more rapidly, and does not require a lot of the kind of extra work that you read about online with milkweed seeds. There's no cold stratification or any of that. It's, you just put those things in the ground and they seem to come up. So that's one of the good things about our native milkweed.
Okay, good deal. So there's some questions coming in through the Q&A. We'll do about 5 more minutes. So if I don't get to your question, then
Yeah, he just answered Mary Ann's question there, I think.
Yep. And then
yeah, you can stick the fresh bluebonnet seeds in the soil now that it's not going to hurt anything with those. I guess I'm not sure which species Mary Ann's talking about propagating summer, fall.
That might be a follow-up question off of, she has an earlier one
Yeah.
about milkweed seeds.
The milkweed is Douglas King seed. So if you're gathering your own wild seed, whether the timing of that you're doing that, you're just really going to have to match the time of the seed set for that species. Some things, little blue stem, for example, only goes to seed late in the fall. Some of our early to mid successional things will go to seed in the spring and then turn around and do it again in the fall. One thing that we have seen is that in general, our seed quality is a little bit less kind of through the middle of the summer. Like you said, just because the moisture availability is not as good, temperatures are high. So if you can catch kind of that spring or fall time, it seems to be a little bit better. The big thing there is if we're wild harvesting, we have to remember that in general, native plants just do not have very good seed quality. And so a lot of our wild harvest stuff, and we've got some data to go back and look at those. They'll be really low, some as low as 5, 10, even 1 or 2%. So looking at doing that wild harvest takes a lot of material to get enough good seed to be able to go ahead and do with. When it comes to touring our native plant location, we can try and set up a time to do that. If somebody would like to do that and we'd like to come down and set up a tour of our facilities to look at our production stuff, that's something we can definitely look at doing. What may be easier for you folks there in Williamson County, as I said, we have our assistant director, our regional office in Stephenville. So instead of making the trip all the way down to Kingsville, Stephenville may be a little bit closer. They have new evaluation, seed production kind of stuff going there. That may be an option as well. I'm not aware of any initiatives to get schools seed for their parking lots. I know a lot of different science teachers do those kind of things on their own, but I'm not aware of any place to help them purchase that or anything like that. Planting native seed on timing. So far, what we know in South Texas is our best times are between August 15th and the end of October. We don't necessarily have the best answers for the rest of the state yet. That's one of the things we're working on. The reason that works well for us in South Texas is we're still really hot, and we catch really predictable fall rains. All of your South Texas landowners will tell you that it's going to rain on or around dove season. They can set their clock by it. The best information we can I can give you on that is to look at your kind of historic climate records and try and match those rainfall patterns and plant before it rains. If you plant after it rains, a lot of times, especially in the spring, by the time it dries out and you're able to get in there and do that planting, that moisture is gone and it's going to be hot right around the corner. So try and do that planting right before any rains, or maybe a little bit earlier in the spring than you could really think of, than you would normally think of. There are some companies that have a sandy land bluebonnet. You just have to ask for that variety specifically. And I think that's about all of the questions I'd seen.
Yeah, I believe that's right. And we are at 8:15 now. So definitely, Tony, thank you so much. Randy, is there anything that you'd like to touch on before we close out?
No, I believe that's great. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you,
Very
everybody.
enjoyable.
All right. Thanks,
Good night.
everyone.
Thank you.